If technology really makes anything possible in life, do you think we understand what this really means for us?
Well, I think one of the observations would be that if you think about who human beings are and how the technology is going to change who human beings are, I think that's perhaps a shock shock approach to it. But I'll just use a simple example. Having been lucky enough to have lived in Japan, there's a tremendous firm there, and the CEO, who's a doctor and a very amazing gentleman, he understood that the human nervous system is a little bit like a network, as we think of an electronic network, and the spinal cord, when severed, effectively eliminates the network. However, that's been the traditional thinking. What he found is that actually, when your brain sends a signal to go down your spinal cord, it also sends a low-grade electrical signal down your skin. So what he was able to do is apply sensors to the skin around people's hips that literally allowed that signal from one's brain to be received below the hips. And he's got a whole exoskeleton that allows you to operate and walk with severed spinal cord. So, the ability to start to operate equipment outside of our own biology using only your mind, to me, is truly the stuff of science fiction. I mean, but it's happening today. And, as people start to think about, well, what would it really mean to live in an environment where my biology is not the only thing that defines me, and to start to operate things outside of your biology using only your brain, to me is a catalyst to allow people to start thinking about things very differently. To say, well, who am I in that case? Because if I can, if it's really just about my, I'll call it consciousness, and how I can project that and affect the world around me, that's very different than how I've traditionally thought about myself, and having food, shelter, and clothing for this biological suit that I wear, because there's something perhaps a bit more ethereal about consciousness that people will then have to start contemplating. And I think that's, to me, a catalyst for how do I think about who I'm going to be. Because if I really change the nature of who I am and my biology, I think that starts to shift people's views of what it means to be human. Because we've already seen a lot of, I mean, I don't know anyone who's ever more than a meter away from one of these devices, but you're starting to see a lot more ingestible and implantable technology. And that's going to very severely change, sort of who people are, what we're good at, what we have to remember. I mean, I think it's already changed a great deal of, of what happens in schools, because people say, do I really need to memorize something, right? Because I can find it in 4 or 5 seconds, on this device. So as that becomes closer and closer to our biology, we have, a different definition of who we are as human beings. And the hope would be that, as people start thinking about that and embracing it as a reality that it will indeed change who we are, then we can start thinking more about, ourselves as philosophers and ourselves as artists and ourselves in, sort of pushing the, the nature of what it means to be alive. As you approach that question and say, okay, well, who is it that I am, and what is it that I do? How do I spend my time? How do I even allocate my time? That, that has been predefined for me up until this point. Now, if I'm really left to my own devices, who am I? What do I do? And I think that there is well, again, it gets very ethereal. The topic of consciousness is going to be very important, because as we continue to talk about artificial intelligence, and we continue to talk about things like, my ability to operate something outside of my biology, or I start to implant technology, inside my biology, I mean, it has the potential to extend life expectancy to something very, very dramatic, right? If I no longer really need, my biological suit in order to remain alive, or at least have consciousness, what does that mean? That leads us down a very a path less traveled, I should say, right? Because that's just something that most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about. But yeah, I think in an artificial intelligent, virtual reality oriented world, there will be questions about what is it that, what do we sense, and is that real, or is something else real?